from being the most vicious mob boss in Canada's history.
Probably the most vicious mob boss, and I call it a mob, organized crime boss this country has ever seen.
To dying in prison, serving a life sentence.
Maurice Boucher died in prison yesterday of cancer. Boucher was the former leader of the HELLS Angels in Quebec. He was serving a life sentence for ordering the killings of 2 prison guards.
This is Maurice Boucher for you. Monsters are not born, they are made. And the making of Maurice Boucher started long before the HELLS Angels. Maurice Boucher's father was a construction worker who came home with his fists ready. There were 8 children in that house in Hochelaga Maisonneuve, the working-class district of inner-city Montreal, where the family had moved when Maurice was 2 years old. And the lesson that the father taught all of them, not with words, but with the specific and repeated violence of a man who drank too much and had too little, was that the world was something that happened to you, and the only question was whether you were going to absorb it or push back. Maurice pushed back. Hochelaga Maisonneuve was not a neighborhood that offered many alternatives. It sat in the east end of Montreal, hemmed in by factories and rail yards, built on the labor of men who worked with their hands and died with nothing to show for it. The construction industry his father moved through was itself deeply connected to organized crime. The Montreal Mafia had embedded itself into Quebec's construction sector so thoroughly that corruption was not an exception to how things worked, but the operating principle beneath everything. Violence was not something that arrived from outside. It was structural. It was the air. Boucher grew up inside that air. He dropped out of school in grade 9 because school had never offered him anything he recognized as useful. A 1975 presentence report, written when he was 21, described a young man who had shoplifted, robbed, and burglarized his way through early adulthood to feed a drug habit that had started in his teens. The report noted, with the particular optimism of social workers who have not yet given up, that he had come to the hour of choice, that he could still follow his father into the construction trade, go straight, become something ordinary. He had the chance, the report said. It was there if he wanted it. He did not want it. What he wanted, though he would not have described it in these terms, was exactly what the neighborhood had taught him to want. The specific, undeniable, unchallengeable kind of power that meant no one could ever put their hands on you again. By the early 1980s, he had found the first version of that power inside a white supremacist motorcycle gang called the SS, which dominated the Pointe-aux-Trembles district of Montreal and ran drugs, extortion, and street-level violence across its territory. It was inside the SS that Boucher, for the first time in his life, became someone that other men followed. It was also inside the SS that he met Salvatore Cazzetta, a man who was everything Boucher was in terms of ambition and ruthlessness, but who had drawn a different line in a different place. The two of them led the gang together, and for a time, their friendship held. But it would not hold forever, and when it broke, it would break in a way that nobody in Montreal would be able to ignore. That, however, was still ahead. For now, there was just the neighborhood, the gang, and a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was never going to be the one on the receiving end of anything ever again. Joining the street gang, the Scores Settlers, was where Boucher learned that he could lead men. It was not a sophisticated organization, it was a white, supremacist motorcycle gang operating out of Pointe-aux-Trembles, running drugs and street-level extortion across its territory, and it attracted the kind of men who had grown up the way Boucher had, with nothing to lose, and no particular reason to believe the legitimate world had anything to offer them. But inside that environment, Boucher discovered something about himself that school had never revealed, and his father had never acknowledged. He was good at this. He could read people, command loyalty, and make decisions under pressure in a way that other men around him simply could not. Salvatore Cazzetta was beside him through all of it. The two men were the co-leaders of the Scores Settlers. They were candidates together to join the HELLS Angels when that club decided to expand its operations further into Quebec. Everything pointed toward them going up together. Then the Lennoxville massacre happened, and everything changed. On March 24, 1985, 5 members of the Hells Angels Laval chapter were invited to a party at the Sorel chapter's clubhouse in Sherbrooke. When they arrived, they were ambushed and shot dead by their own brothers. The motive was internal, since the Laval chapter had been accused of using too much of the product they were supposed to be selling and skimming money from a Nova Scotia chapter. But the method was what mattered. The bodies were wrapped in sleeping bags, tied to weightlifting plates, and dropped into the St. Lawrence River, where divers found them 2 months later in an advanced state of decomposition. The Angels had executed 5 of their own members and disposed of them like waste. Cazetta found this unforgivable. The outlaw code, as he understood it, did not permit brothers killing brothers over money, and he refused, regardless of opportunity or consequence, to align himself with men who had done that. He turned down the Hells Angels and instead founded the Rock Machine with his brother Giovanni in 1986, a decision that would eventually cost over 160 people their lives. Boucher was not troubled by Lennoxville in the same way. He was, by multiple accounts, impressed by it. It proved to him that the Angels were sufficiently ruthless for his tastes, and his only criticism of the man who ordered the killings was that he had spared 3 Laval members instead of finishing the job completely. In 1986, after completing a 40-month prison sentence for the armed assault of a 16-year-old girl, Boucher joined the Quebec Hells Angels. He became a fully patched member on May 1, 1987, and president of the Sorel chapter later that same year. The 2 men who had once run the same gang in the same neighborhood were now on opposite sides of the most significant divide in Quebec's criminal underworld. Cazetta had the Rock Machine. Boucher had the Hells Angels. And each of them understood, without needing to say it, that the city was not big enough for both organizations to keep growing indefinitely. For a few years, an uneasy peace held. Boucher, by most accounts, had genuine respect for the Cazetta brothers since they were connected to the Rizzuto crime family, and attacking them would have meant attacking the mafia, which even Boucher was not yet ready to do. So the 2 organizations coexisted, circling each other in the same territory, running parallel operations, watching and waiting. Then, in May 1994, Salvatore Cazetta was arrested at a pit bull farm in connection with a conspiracy to import 11 tons of cocaine. He was extradited to Florida, convicted, and gone, removed from the board entirely. And with the one man Boucher had been unwilling to move against now, sitting in an American federal prison, there was nothing left to hold him back. Climbing the ranks. By the time Boucher became a fully patched Hells Angel in May 1987, the organization he was joining was not at its strongest. The Lennoxville massacre had gutted the Quebec chapter from the inside. The national president had fled to Morocco to escape murder charges. Senior members had been convicted and imprisoned. The Angels' grip on Montreal's drug trade had loosened, and in the vacuum they left behind, independent dealers, the Rock Machine, and various smaller criminal organizations had moved in and taken ground. The club that Boucher joined was powerful enough on paper but operationally weakened, and that weakness for a man with his specific ambitions was not a problem. It was an opportunity. He moved fast. By the end of 1987, he was already president of the Sorel chapter, the same chapter whose leadership had ordered the Lennoxville killings 2 years earlier. It was not a position that came with stability. It came with expectations, and Boucher understood exactly what those expectations were. He stopped drinking. He stopped using drugs. Multiple sources noted the change specifically, pointing to the Lennoxville massacre as the moment Boucher understood that substance abuse was what had brought the Laval chapter down, and he was not going to let the same thing happen to him. The man who had spent his 20s shoplifting, robbing, and burglarizing to feed a drug habit made a cold, calculated decision to become someone who could not be controlled by anything. One of his first moves was to build connections outside the club. Through a former Montreal police officer named Guy Lepage, who had been dismissed from the force for associating with the mafia, Boucher established a direct line to the Rizzuto crime family, Montreal's dominant organized crime organization. That relationship would become one of the defining assets of his entire operation, giving the HELLS Angels access to cocaine supply chains and mafia distribution networks that no motorcycle club in Canada had ever had before. By the early 1990s, he was considered one of the most powerful bikers in all of Quebec, operating across cocaine trafficking, loan sharking, and a growing network of legitimate business fronts designed to launder the money flowing through the organization. When he filed his income taxes during this period, he listed his occupation variously as a chef, a construction worker, a used car salesman, and a real estate developer. He owned properties in Acapulco, Mexico, hosted parties attended by senior officers of the Mexican police, and could not enter the United States because of his criminal record. On March 26, 1992, he founded the Rockers Motor Club, a puppet organization designed to serve the HELLS Angels' operational needs while insulating full members from direct exposure to criminal liability. The Rockers would go on to commit most of the murders during the Quebec Biker War, carrying out violence on behalf of the parent club while keeping the Angels' hands officially clean. It was a structural innovation that reflected exactly how Boucher's mind worked. Not impulsive, not reckless, but systematic. Every layer of the organization was designed to protect the layer above it, and at the top of all of it was him. His relationship with Salvatore Cazzetta's rock machine had remained, up to this point, cautiously non-confrontational. The Cazzetta brothers had deep ties to the Rizzuto family, and Boucher was unwilling to move against anyone connected to the mafia while he was still building his position. So the two organizations circled each other across the same territory, running parallel operations, neither one willing to fire the first shot while the other's protection held. Then, in 1994, Salvatore Cazzetta was arrested at a pit bull farm in Fort Erie, Ontario, charged with conspiring to import 11 tons of cocaine valued at an estimated $275 million. He was extradited to Florida, convicted, and removed from the equation entirely. Boucher summoned the senior HELLS Angels leadership from every Quebec chapter to a hotel in Longueuil on July 15, 1994. The agenda was a vote on whether to go to war against the rock machine and every independent drug dealer in Montreal who refused to buy exclusively from the Angels. The Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec City chapters voted in favor. Only the Sherbrooke chapter opposed it. The vote passed. Boucher had been waiting for this moment for years, and now there was nothing left standing between him and the monopoly he had always intended to build. The ultimatum was simple. Every drug dealer in Montreal had a choice: buy from the HELLS Angels or face the consequences. There was no negotiation, no middle ground, and no timeline for consideration. It was an offer structured exactly like the ones that do not get refused, and Boucher had built enough of an organization by 1994 that the threat behind it was not abstract. It was immediate and it was credible. The rock machine refused. On July 13, 1994, 3 men walked into a downtown motorcycle shop in the Rivière des Prairies neighborhood of Montreal and shot Pierre Daoust, a Death Riders member affiliated with the HELLS Angels, 16 times. The rock machine was sending a message back. 2 days later, Boucher had every senior HELLS Angels chapter president in Quebec sitting in a hotel room in Longueuil, voting on war. The vote passed, and from that moment, the Quebec Biker War was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. What followed over the next 8 years was a level of sustained, organized violence that had no precedent in Canadian history and very little in North American history, outside of the major American mafia conflicts of the mid-20th century. 162 people were killed. Over 200 were wounded. There were 84 bombings and 130 cases of arson spread across Montreal and the surrounding regions, targeting clubhouses, bars, vehicles, and in several cases, people who had nothing to do with any of it. The most devastating single moment of the entire war came on August 9, 1995, when a Jeep parked on a street in the Hochelaga Maisonneuve neighborhood, the same neighborhood where Boucher had grown up, was detonated by remote control. The bomb had been placed there to kill a rival gang member. But an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrochers was playing in a nearby yard when it went off, and the shrapnel killed him. He was not a biker. He was not connected to anyone. He was a child playing outside on a summer afternoon in his own neighborhood. And he was dead because two criminal organizations were fighting over who controlled the drug trade on his street. The public reaction was immediate and sustained in a way that previous incidents had not been. Protests followed. Politicians responded. In October 1995, the Quebec government formed the Wolverine Squad, a specialized police unit created specifically to dismantle biker gang operations across the province. It was the first formal acknowledgement by Canadian law enforcement that existing policing structures were not equipped to deal with what Boucher had built. Boucher's response to the Wolverine Squad was to keep going. The Rockers, the puppet club he had founded in 1992, were carrying out most of the operational violence, moving through targets identified by the Angels' leadership while the full members maintained enough legal distance to avoid direct prosecution. Car bombs were being deployed in city centers. Rival bars were being firebombed. Members of the Rock Machine were being shot in restaurants, parking lots, and on their own doorsteps. And the Rock Machine was responding in kind, hitting Angels-affiliated targets, bombing clubhouses, and killing anyone they could reach. On the other side, by 1999, after 5 years of sustained conflict, the Rock Machine had been largely decimated. The alliance they had built with other independent criminal organizations had collapsed under the pressure of sustained Hells Angels attacks. Desperate for support, they reached out to the Bandidos, the American outlaw motorcycle club that had already established itself across Europe. And in December 2001, the Rock Machine officially patched over to become Bandidos Canada in a ceremony at their Kingston chapter clubhouse. It did not save them. Boucher had already been negotiating with Ontario bikers on a separate track, and in December 2000, nearly 200 Ontario bikers patched over to the Hells Angels, giving the club immediate entry into the coveted Ontario drug market that the Bandidos had been hoping to claim. The Bandidos' Canadian operation was outmaneuvered before it had properly begun. Then, in September 2000, a veteran crime reporter named Michel Auger was ambushed in the parking lot of his employer, the Journal de Montréal, and shot 6 times in the back. He had been writing articles directly linking Boucher to murders, and the contract on his life had come from the Hells Angels. Auger survived by calling 911 from his cell phone while still lying in the parking lot. He returned to work 3 months later and kept writing. The attempted murder of a journalist in a public parking lot in broad daylight was the moment Quebec's public patience ran out entirely. Protests erupted across Montreal. Journalists marched in the streets demanding federal anti-gang legislation. The Rizzuto crime family, alarmed at the prospect of a Canadian equivalent of the American RICO Act being passed in response, intervened directly and brokered a ceasefire between Boucher and Rock Machine President Frédéric Faucher. The two men met at a courthouse in Quebec City on September 27, 2000. The ceasefire lasted a few weeks. Then the violence resumed. But it no longer mattered, because the end was already being built from the inside. A Hells Angels associate named Danny Kane had been feeding detailed intelligence to the RCMP for years, and Montreal Police Commander Maurice Boucher had been using that intelligence to build a case that would not fall apart the way previous prosecutions had. Using DNA evidence recovered from discarded food containers and coffee cups left behind by Angels members in public places, his team linked 4 members directly to murders that had previously gone unsolved. On March 28, 2001, at dawn, 2,000 federal, provincial, and municipal officers executed 77 simultaneous raids across Quebec. Operation Springtime had begun, and by the end of that morning, the organization Boucher had spent a decade building was in pieces on the floor. By 1997, Boucher had decided that the war needed a new front. The Wolverine Squad was making arrests. Prosecutors were building cases. Gang members who found themselves facing serious prison time were beginning to consider their options. And the option that worried Boucher most was the one where they walked into a prosecutor's office and started talking. The entire structure he had built depended on loyalty, and loyalty, he understood, was a fragile thing when the alternative was decades in a federal penitentiary. He needed to send a message that would make the alternative feel worse than the sentence. His logic was specific and, in its own way, methodical. He did not want to target prosecutors directly, because killing a prosecutor would bring down the kind of federal response that even he could not absorb. He did not want to target police officers for the same reason. What he wanted was a target that was visible enough to be understood as a direct attack on the justice system, but low enough on the institutional hierarchy that the response would be manageable. He settled on prison guards, who he described as the bottom of the justice system's totem pole. He was wrong about that last part, but that came later. In the spring of 1997, Boucher met with Stéphane Gagné, a career criminal from the same Hochelaga Maisonneuve neighborhood where Boucher had grown up. Gagné, whose nickname was Godas, meaning old shoe, had been sentenced to 2 years for cocaine dealing in 1994 and had served time at Bordeaux prison, where he had attacked a Rock Machine member who had asked him to stomp on a photograph of Boucher. That act of loyalty had been noticed, and by 1997, Gagné was a prospect with the Nomads, the elite chapter Boucher had founded and led, and he was prepared to do whatever Boucher asked of him. What Boucher asked was straightforward. Find a prison guard, kill them. It did not matter which one. The only requirement was that the target had a badge. On June 26, 1997, Gagné drove alongside a car leaving the Tanguay Women's Prison in Montreal and opened fire. The driver was Diane Levine, 42 years old, a correctional officer who had chosen her target at random from among the guards driving away from the facility that evening. She was shot and killed. She had been selected because she was in the right place at the right time with the right identification on her jacket. When Gagné reported back to Boucher afterward and mentioned that he had killed a woman, Boucher's response was recorded and would later be read aloud in open court. He said it did not matter that she had been a woman. What mattered was that she had been a guard. Diane Levine was 42 years old. She had 2 children. She was the first correctional officer ever murdered in the line of duty in Quebec's history. 3 months later, on September 8, 1997, Gagné and a fellow Nomads prospect named Paul Fontaine positioned themselves outside the Rivière des Prairies prison and waited. When correctional officer Pierre Rondeau, 49 years old, drove away from the facility at the end of his shift, they opened fire. Rondeau was killed. A third guard, Robert Corriveau, was wounded in the same attack and survived. 2 prison guards were killed in 3 months. Both were chosen at random. Both were murdered specifically because of the uniform they wore, and nothing else. The public reaction was unlike anything the Quebec Biker War had previously generated, and that was saying something given that it had already produced the death of an 11-year-old child. The prison guard's union president told reporters that it was as though a father had been asked to drive the man who had assaulted his daughter to court. The imagery landed. Quebec was no longer watching this conflict from a distance. It had been brought directly into the institutions that were supposed to protect ordinary people from it. Boucher was arrested on December 18, 1997, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was held at the Tanguay Women's Prison in a special cell, kept separate from the general population. His preliminary hearing had to proceed without him after the prison guards at Rivière des Prairies refused to transport him to court. Their union president stated publicly that they would not drive the man who had ordered them killed to his own hearing. He had wanted to send a message to the justice system. He had sent one. But it was not the message he intended, and the response it generated would eventually cost him everything. The first trial began on March 19, 1998, and from the beginning, it was not going well for the Crown. The key witness was Stéphane Gagné, the man who had pulled the trigger on both victims and who had agreed to testify against Boucher in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gagné was not a sympathetic figure. He was a career criminal, a convicted drug dealer, and a self-confessed murderer, and Boucher's defense lawyer, Jacques La Rochelle, understood exactly how to use that against the prosecution. During cross-examination, La Rochelle got Gagné to admit on the record that he had no respect for the truth and would tell any lie that served his interests. It was a damaging concession, and the judge made it worse. Justice Claude Boilard, who presided over the trial, made a series of rulings that systematically weakened the Crown's case. He excluded 5 recordings of intercepted phone calls made by Boucher, ruling that the warrants used to obtain them had been applied for improperly. He displayed what observers in the courtroom described as an unmistakable bias toward the defense throughout the proceedings. And in his final instructions to the jury, he all but told them to acquit, spending considerable time attacking Gagné's credibility and framing the evidence in terms that left the jury with very little room to reach a guilty verdict. On November 27, 1998, the jury acquitted Boucher of ordering the murders of Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau. He walked out of the courthouse and into a city where, in certain circles, he was treated as a folk hero. Photographs circulated of him smiling outside the court building. Supporters gathered. The message that went out through Montreal's criminal underworld was clear. The justice system had tried to bring down Maurice Boucher, and it had failed. And that failure was public and documented and impossible to explain away. Inside Quebec's police forces and prosecutors' offices, the reaction was the opposite. The acquittal sent what one officer described as a wave of despondency through every law enforcement agency in the province. If a man who had ordered the random murders of 2 correctional officers could walk free after a full criminal trial, then the existing legal framework was simply not adequate for what they were facing. But Crown Attorney France Charbonneau was not finished. Charbonneau, who would later become famous as the lead commissioner of Quebec's landmark anti-corruption inquiry, filed an appeal arguing that Justice Boilard's instructions to the jury had been so egregiously pro-defense that they constituted a serious legal error, and that there was credible evidence the jury had been subjected to intimidation during the proceedings. On October 10, 2000, the Quebec Court of Appeal agreed with her on both counts. In a ruling that was extraordinary by any measure, the appeals court overturned the double jeopardy principle that normally prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime, declared the first trial fatally compromised, and ordered a new trial. Boucher was arrested leaving a restaurant. The same day the ruling came down, Commander André Bouchard, his longtime nemesis in the Montreal police, made the arrest personally. He later recalled that Boucher was furious, swearing continuously at the officers who took him in because he had genuinely never expected double jeopardy to be overturned. In his world, an acquittal was an acquittal. The idea that the system could simply reach back and undo it had not been part of his calculation. The second trial began on March 26, 2002, and it was a different proceeding in almost every respect. The jury was shielded from public view by an opaque screen throughout the entire trial, an extraordinary security measure designed to prevent the kind of intimidation that had allegedly compromised the first proceedings. France Charbonneau received death threats throughout the month that the trial ran, and proceeded anyway. She described herself publicly as a woman of conviction who did not play, and the way she prosecuted the case bore that out. This time, Gagné's testimony was presented differently, and the judge's instructions to the jury were balanced. The intercepted phone calls that had been excluded the first time were addressed through other evidence, and the jury, 8 men and 4 women, deliberated and returned with a verdict on May 5, 2002. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on 1 count of attempted murder for the wounding of Robert Corriveau, 3 concurrent life sentences, no possibility of parole for 25 years. Because there were 2 murder convictions, Boucher could not invoke the faint hope clause that allows some prisoners to apply for early parole review after 15 years. The court also ordered him to provide a DNA sample for the National Criminal Database. Justice Pierre Béliveau, who delivered the sentence, noted the gravity of the offenses and ruled in the direction of the Crown on every point of contention in the sentencing hearing. Léon Lavigne, the father of Diane Lavigne, sat in the front row of the courtroom with his wife and surviving daughter as the sentence was read. His daughter Danielle, who had attended every day of the month-long trial and carried a photograph of her sister pressed against her heart during the verdict, told reporters afterward that justice had been done and that they could go on with their lives. Boucher was taken directly from the courtroom to Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines, Canada's only supermax federal penitentiary, located north of Montreal. He was placed in the Special Handling Unit, a facility within the facility designed for the most dangerous inmates in the Canadian federal prison system, isolated from the general population and kept under conditions that reflected the assessment that he remained an active threat even behind bars. He had spent 5 years trying to make the justice system afraid of him. In the end, the justice system had simply outlasted him. On the morning of March 28, 2001, 2,000 police officers moved simultaneously across Quebec. It was the largest organized crime operation in Canadian history, and it had been years in the making. The intelligence that drove it had come from multiple sources, but the most significant was Danny Kane, a HELLS Angels associate who had been feeding detailed reports to the RCMP since the mid-1990s while living a double life inside the organization. Kane's information had given investigators a map of the Angels' operational structure, a list of murders and the men responsible for them, and enough detail about the internal hierarchy to build prosecutable cases against people who had, until then, remained insulated from direct criminal exposure by the layers of puppet clubs and intermediaries that Boucher had specifically designed the organization to have. Commander André Bouchard had taken Kane's reports and assigned 2 detectives, Louis-Marc Pelletier and Michel Tremblay, to re-examine the forensic evidence from every murder Kane had identified. What they found, after months of painstaking work, was 4 pieces of previously undetected DNA evidence, recovered from skin flakes and saliva on tissues found at crime scenes that had long since been considered cold. Bouchard then authorized an unconventional collection method, having officers follow Angels members and associates through public spaces and retrieve discarded items, uneaten food left at restaurant tables, cardboard coffee cups thrown into trash cans, anything that carried biological material that could be tested against the DNA profiles they had built. It was patient, methodical police work of exactly the kind that Boucher had never anticipated, because it operated entirely outside the boundaries he thought he had drawn around himself. Operation Springtime executed 77 simultaneous raids across Quebec in the early hours of March 28th. By the end of that morning, 142 people had been arrested, including 80 of the 106 full-patch HELLS Angels in the province, the entire Nomads chapter that Boucher had built and led, and every single member of both the Rockers and the Evil Ones puppet clubs. The organizations that had carried out most of the murders during the Quebec Biker War were, in a single morning, effectively gone. Boucher was already in custody at the time of the raids, held on remand while awaiting his second trial on the prison guard murders. But the operation reached into his life anyway. 2 of his houses were seized by authorities under proceeds of crime legislation. 13 new murder charges were laid against him personally, in addition to the charges he was already facing. And his son Francis, then 25 years old and a member of the Rockers, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutor who handled the cases that followed the Operation Springtime arrests, Randall Richmond, addressed Francis Boucher's involvement directly during sentencing proceedings in 2004. He told the court that the most heartless example in the entire case was that of Maurice Boucher, who had taken his own son and made him a criminal in his own organization, and that Francis's 10-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder, drug trafficking, and gangsterism was a direct consequence of his father's choices as much as his own. He had grown up watching his father build the most powerful criminal organization in Canadian history, and he had followed him into it the way some sons follow their fathers into a trade, because it was the only world he had ever been shown. The organization itself did not survive Operation Springtime intact. The arrests created a vacuum in Montreal's drug market that was briefly filled by the Bandidos Canadian operation, which had absorbed the remnants of the Rock Machine in December 2001. But by June 2002, a follow-on operation called Operation Bandido had swept up the entire Bandidos Canadian leadership in a single roundup, effectively ending their presence in Quebec. For the first time since 1994, Both sides of the conflict that had killed over 160 people were simultaneously behind bars, and the Quebec Biker War was over. What remained of the Hells Angels in Quebec was a fraction of what Boucher had built. The chapters were hollowed out. The leadership was imprisoned. The puppet club infrastructure that had given the organization its operational capacity had been dismantled entirely. It would take years for the Angels to rebuild any meaningful presence in the province. And when they did, it was a different organization in almost every structural sense, operating under a level of law enforcement scrutiny that had not existed before Boucher had made it necessary. In 2009, a second major operation called Operation Charqc targeted the rebuilt Quebec Hells Angels leadership, resulting in the arrest of nearly the entire provincial membership in coordinated raids across Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Investigators described it as the culmination of more than 80 separate investigations going back to 1995. It was, in effect, the second dismantling of an organization that Boucher had built and that had rebuilt itself after the first one, and it reflected the fundamental change in Canadian law enforcement that his decade of violence had made permanent. The Joint Task Force model, the specialized prosecutors, the anti-gang provisions written directly into the criminal code, the Supermax prison protocols. All of it existed because of what Boucher had done, and all of it was now being used against the organization he had left behind. He had built something that outlasted him, but what it ran into, once he was gone, was a system that he had inadvertently taught how to fight back. Boucher spent the first years of his imprisonment at Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines doing what he had always done. He organized. From inside the Special Handling Unit of Canada's only Supermax federal penitentiary, isolated from the general population and monitored under conditions designed specifically to prevent exactly what he was doing, Boucher maintained contact with the outside world through the limited channels available to him. He survived multiple assassination attempts inside the prison, motivated by rivals who understood that even an imprisoned Boucher was a dangerous one, and was moved into increasingly isolated housing as the attempts accumulated. In October 2010, a member of the Indian Posse, an Aboriginal street gang that had come into conflict with a Hells Angels puppet club, wounded him in a knife attack inside the facility. He survived that too. In November 2015, 13 years into his life sentence, Quebec police executed a series of raids across Montreal as part of Operations Maggot and Mastiff, targeting what investigators described as a three-way criminal alliance between the Hells Angels, the Rizzuto crime family, and various street gangs that had quietly rebuilt itself in the years since Operation Springtime. 48 people were arrested. Among them was Maurice Boucher, taken from his cell at Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines, and his daughter Alexandra Mongeau. The charge was conspiracy to commit murder. From inside a Supermax prison cell, Boucher had orchestrated a plot to kill Reynald Desjardins, a former lieutenant of the Rizzuto crime family who had become a rival. The method he had used to run the operation was precise and limited by necessity. He had one contact on the outside, and that contact was Alexandra. She passed his instructions to Gregory Woolley, a Hells Angels member and the reputed leader of a street gang called the Syndicates, who had been one of Boucher's most loyal associates since the 1990s. Woolley then moved the instructions through the network. Police had been monitoring the chain for long enough to document it thoroughly before making the arrests. Lieutenant Benoit Dubé, who led the investigation, told reporters at the press conference announcing the arrests that Boucher had one contact, and that contact was Alexandra, and that Alexandra's contact was Woolley. It was described with a matter-of-fact precision of a man, explaining something that should not have been possible but plainly was. Alexandra Mongeau was 28 years old at the time of her arrest. She had grown up as the daughter of the most notorious criminal in Quebec history, and she had made choices that reflected that inheritance. In 2018, after the cases from the Maggot and Mastiff operations concluded, Boucher pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and received an additional 10-year sentence to run concurrent with his existing life term. Alexandra was acquitted of the murder conspiracy charge, but pleaded guilty to concealment of proceeds of crime and received a 21-month community sentence. Among her conditions was a restriction on communicating with her father, except in writing. His son Francis had, in the meantime, provided the most vivid illustration of what it meant to carry the Boucher name in Quebec's criminal world. In March 2015, Francis was serving a short sentence at Montreal's Bordeaux jail for uttering death threats against a police officer when he walked out of the facility 2 months before the end of his term. A guard had processed his release paperwork against the wrong prisoner, confusing Francis Boucher with another inmate named Michel Stéphane Boucher. The Quebec Minister of Public Security looked at the circumstances and said publicly that it did not look accidental to her. It looked like a planned escape. A guard was suspended with pay while authorities investigated. Francis surrendered to police 4 days later, accompanied by his lawyer, and was charged with escaping lawful custody and fraudulently impersonating another prisoner. He had previously accumulated convictions for gangsterism, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was denied bail at his court appearance, since he had not yet completed the sentence he had been serving when he walked out. Maurice Boucher had ruined his own son, in the words of the prosecutor, who had said so in open court a decade earlier, and the son had gone on to confirm it in every subsequent chapter of his life. Boucher had been battling throat cancer for 7 years by the time authorities transferred him in June 2022 from Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines to the nearby Archambault institution to receive palliative care. The transfer was conducted in secrecy. He had turned 69 on June 21st. On July 10, 2022, he died of throat cancer in the palliative care unit at Archambault. Before he died, the Sûreté du Québec made an attempt to obtain a deathbed confession, sending investigators to his bedside in the hope that a dying man might finally account for the crimes that had never been formally attributed to him, the murders that had gone unsolved, the orders that had been carried out by men who were now dead or imprisoned, the full accounting of what the Quebec Biker War had actually cost and who had been responsible for each piece of it. He gave them nothing. Quebec. Premier François Legault issued a brief statement acknowledging his death. The president of the Quebec Prison Guards Union, Mathieu Lavoie, confirmed the news that had first been reported by La Presse. Julien Cher, a journalist who had spent years covering the Hells Angels and had written 2 books about the organization, told Global News that Boucher had been a kingpin, one of the most notorious organized crime leaders in Canadian history, a man who had ruled the streets of Montreal and brought in millions for the Angels while unleashing, in Cher's words, a wave of terror on the city. The wave was over. The man who had made it was gone, and the city he had spent 30 years terrorizing went on without him. He had wanted to build something that could not be touched. He had built something that could not be forgotten. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the measure of everything he lost. 162 people were killed in the war he started. Canada rewrote its criminal laws because of him, and in the end, the only thing he refused to give anyone was the truth. He died with it. But across the Atlantic, another organization was doing the same thing. Simultaneously, on an even larger scale, across an entire continent, with stolen military rockets, car bombs, and a body count that forced multiple governments to rewrite their laws just to respond to it. Click on the next video to see how that unfolds.